She dropped her last dime on 47 unwanted pigs, while those townfolks chuckled the whole wagon ride home. They figured Elena Thorne was finished, swore her homestead would belong to another outfit before the first deep winter snow. What those gossips missed was that Elena was already scheming, already plotting. She spotted a gold mine in that sorry livestock that no one else had the grit to see. This here is the tale of a pioneer woman who took absolute trash and forged a frontier empire, and the heavy toll she paid. Tell you what, drop your hometown below and hit like, so you and I can see how far this Old West legend travels today. We settled. Dawn of the Harwick Livestock Auction. Elena woke well before 4 a.m., just laying quiet in the pitch black. She studied the rough timber ceiling, tracing a summer water stain that had grown into a dark, twisted shape she couldn't quite recognize. That cast-iron stove burned out around midnight. She felt that familiar October frost creeping into the cabin. It wasn't the brutal sting of a blizzard just yet, but that stubborn, creeping chill that burrows into your bones. She finally rose, stoked the hearth with her final pieces of chopped birch, standing in thick woolen socks on freezing hearthstones as the tinder blazed up. Then the kettle. She grabbed that same tin coffee cup her daddy bought at a Laramie trading post nearly 9 long years ago. She never took a chair, just stood by the frosted glass, watching shadows bleed off the ridge as the sky turned a dark, battered purple. Those jagged peaks slowly taking shape, like a rough trail revealing itself once your trail-weary eyes finally gather the light. 27 years old. Both her folks resting in the dirt out behind the cottonwoods, just $43 hidden beneath the floorboards. She reckoned they had 11. Bitter weeks until the mountain passes thawed out for supply wagons. Plus a heavy banknote down at the Territorial Savings Association in Durance sitting waiting for her in April. $412 she simply lacked, with no visible trail to hunt it down. She had tallied that math until the numbers felt worn perfectly smooth, just like river rocks tumbled in the current. The cattle she tried raising after her mama passed caught a nasty tick fever 2 summers prior. She had to auction her prime breeding stock just to buy winter hay. All that survived in the old Holloway spread was a meager vegetable patch she canned in glass jars, an aging milk cow named Pearl, 1 stubborn mule, and the raw earth. 42 acres of jagged slope and muddy creek bed. Folks across the valley swore it was only fit for mountain goats, not real farming. She had swallowed that harsh judgment, whispered and shouted for years on end. Folks said it was a fair piece of land, if you enjoyed bleeding for it. Wondered why Old Man Holloway refused to leave. Hard ground breeds hard times. Elena grew up chewing on those sour words, but she learned to let them bounce right off. Let's look closer together. What she understood about that rocky ridge was entirely different. She had boot-tracked every square inch since she was knee-high. She knew exactly where the springs ran icy and pure through a scorching August drought. She mapped the south-facing draws that trapped the warm March sun. She knew that hidden ravine behind the second ridge where the fierce wind died and heavy hickory timber thrived. That was the same hardwood her daddy hauled to build their stone smokehouse into the earth back when she was just a 9-year-old girl. That forgotten smokehouse kept calling to her. Her old man built it the way. He built his life methodically, stubborn, built to outlast his own bones. He dragged river rock up from the muddy bottoms and hand-mixed the mortar, hammered in oak racks and heavy iron hooks, cutting drafts so clean that the fortress still breathed perfectly today. It sat mostly empty since he got planted, smoking an occasional mule deer or a rack of bartered beef. Elena dutifully kept it up, patching cracked seams, fixing busted iron hinges, and keeping the dirt floor swept bone dry. She kept it primed without really knowing what kind of frontier harvest she was expecting. Everything shifted that September. She was thumbing through her daddy's old news scraps, a weathered copy of Western Territories, Commerce Weekly from 4 years prior. Those fragile pages turning dry and brittle and spotted. A Cheyenne hotel supplier's bold advertisement. listing out the premium gold they'd pay for cured frontier pork. Those dollar signs stopped her cold. She reread the bounty, folded that clipping into her heavy coat pocket, and marched across her wild territory in the freezing daylight, seeing her rocky homestead through an entirely new lens. That livestock auction was her next move. Stick with me. She'd plotted this for 3 weeks. Let's step into Harwick's livestock yard down at the south edge of Durant's. It was a dusty maze of timber pens and loading chutes carrying that same old familiar smell. Manure, damp straw, and the jittery tension of spooked livestock trapped in strange corrals. By the time Elena rolled up with her mule and empty wagon, that auction yard was already packed. You had cattlemen, ranch hands, and local merchants leaning lazy against the rough fence rails. Most swapped tails in that relaxed way cowboys do when they're amongst their own kind. Elena hitched her mule and strolled the holding pens. The beef cattle sold first, mostly yearlings, some cows, and one sturdy bull that sparked a fierce bidding war between 3 rival ranchers who clearly hated each other's guts. Elena just watched. She didn't bid. Horses hit the block next. Then came the stragglers, goats, a few sheep. 2 dried-up dairy cows nobody cared to own, and finally, the aging sows. They sat in the furthest corral, 47 of them. Old breeding hogs that a local rancher named Delwood Pruitt figured weren't worth their winter grain. Elena had studied that herd a week prior, right after Pruitt spread the word he was selling out. She killed a whole hour inside that pen, stepping quiet amongst them, tracking their heavy movements, checking their health barehanded. Other buyers had breezed through in 5 minutes and left shaking their heads, but she stayed an hour. Cobble, a scrawny auctioneer with a voice like snapping pine, started those sows at $4 a head. Nobody flinched. He dropped to $3. Dead silence. He scanned the crowd, knowing exactly how this would end. $2 a head for the whole lot. Anybody interested? These are mature breeding stock, folks. Fine confirmation. Someone in the crowd hollered, "They're done breeding!" That's exactly why he is selling them. Laughter rippled through the dirt yard. "Casper rendering plant will take them," another mocked. "That is surely their final stop." Cobble's face agreed, though his paycheck kept his mouth firmly shut. Elena raised her hand high. "I will take the lot." You know that heavy silence when the frontier throws a curveball? The yard went dead quiet. Then a lone chuckle broke out. Wasn't a mean chuckle, just pure shock. A few more stockmen chimed in, until full-blown laughter echoed across the whole dusty arena. Cobble eyed her real cautious, the way seasoned auctioneers size up a wild card bidder. "The whole herd, ma'am. At $2 a head? Yes, that is $94. I know what 47 times 2 equals. The ranchers laughed again, neither friendly nor completely cruel. Cobble slammed his heavy wooden gavel. Old man Pruitt stood by the rails, wearing the baffled scowl of a rancher who just scored unexpected cash from a mighty unexpected buyer. He ambled over while she was signing the auction paperwork. "You realize these old hogs are done producing," he warned. He genuinely wasn't trying to be mean. He honestly sounded worried for her. "I know," Elena replied. "They will eat you completely bankrupt over this winter. That is my business." He studied her a quiet second longer, tipped his hat, and slowly walked away. Pruitt was a fair man, just lacking vision. Elena had just dropped $94 when she only owned 43 to her name. She had borrowed the remaining $51 from Calla Birch, the only soul endurance she trusted enough to ask for a grub steak. Calla ran the dry goods counter at Fenwick's Mercantile, and once admitted she had funded far worse schemes with a lot less proof. No fancy bank papers for this loan, just a handshake promise to pay back $60 by spring. Elena accepted without a single blink. It left her pockets completely empty, which she figured felt a whole lot cleaner than almost empty. Almost nothing brings hesitation. Absolute zero demands pure cowboy commitment. You follow. Driving 47 stubborn hogs up that steep mountain switchback toward the Holloway spread burned daylight, testing the grit of Elena, her mule, and everything breathing. Those heavy hogs refused to cooperate. Weren't panicked, neither. Just hard-headed the way old livestock gets when they realize a rancher's grand plans are nothing but a downright chore. They plodded along at their own stubborn pace, which was painfully slow. They scattered across that dirt trail, making any dream of hurting them purely a fantasy. Still, Elena somehow made it work. 4 grueling hours, plus one nasty mess where 6 sows busted through a creek fence and needed dragging out of the thick willow brush. By late afternoon, though, that entire herd was safely locked down in the lower grazing pasture. Elena rested on the top rail in the fading sunset, eating her last stale crust of breakfast bread, just watching those pigs settle in. Even way up there, she could hear wagon wheels echoing off the Durance Trail. Likely the very folks who watched her crazy auction stunt. Stick with me, friends. Frontier gossip travels mighty fast in a small valley. Listen here. By tomorrow, she figured every soul at that livestock auction would have bent 2 ears, and those folks would tell 3 more. Naturally, the tale would gather dust and wild details to make the telling sweeter. That didn't bother our girl one bit. Folks around Durant had been spinning yarns about her since her folks passed on, and she held down that homestead solo. The widow's girl refusing to sell out. The lass who reckons she can run that hillside property all by her lonesome. She outlived most of those rumors, just by standing her ground when the busybodies circled back to check on her. Right then, her mind was set on livestock feed. The hitch in her grand plan, and she knew darn well it was a hitch, was that standard livestock farming logic demanded stuffing your animals with grain to pack on weight quick, rushing them to the butcher before they ate up your hard-earned profits. Every seasoned rancher in this valley swore by that exact math. Grain cost dear money, and time cost more. A slow-growing hog was a losing hand, but Elena had 0 plans to run a standard farm operation. She'd been chewing on this since September, studying anything she could rustle up, her daddy's dusty farming almanacs, a couple agriculture manuals from the Durant Library, and a hotel supplier ad from the Commerce Weekly that sparked the fire. What she kept rolling around her mind was a riddle none of those homesteading books could rightly answer. Why did true smoked meat become a legend, while most just tasted like plain smoke? Her old man cured a ham once. She was barely 12, but she remembered it clear as day. Her mama called it the finest eating on earth. And it wasn't their own pig. Her dad traded for it from an old-timer named Voss, a fella who ran his hogs wild out in the eastern scrub timber. Old Voss passed on 2 harsh winters later, taking his trade to the grave. And nobody in these parts has tasted a cut of ham like that since. For 15 years, Elena turned that flavor over in her mind the way a person studies a mystery. Now, she reckoned, she finally held a piece of the puzzle. Her first week, she strung up a new fence, not because the old pasture wire wouldn't hold a herd, but because she needed those hogs to roam free up on that rugged hillside, that rocky stretch of scrub oak and windfall apples her mama planted along the South Ridge 20 years ago, left to nature and mostly forgotten. Those trees had grown wild, still dropping small, stubborn, bitter fruit that nobody bothered picking because it simply wasn't worth the human sweat. You and I know how stubborn pigs are. Well, her new fence cut a trail from the bottomlands right up to that ridge. Every sunrise she drove them up, and every sundown she brought them home. That chore took precious time. By day 3, it left her standing knee-deep in a muddy creek, fighting to drive a lazy 300-pound sow up the steep bank, while the rest of the herd just watched her with what looked like mild amusement. She stood there thinking, I am making a significant mistake. That doubt lasted about 30 seconds. Then she hauled that sow straight up the bank. Before the week was out, those animals took to the slope naturally. She'd feared they'd just hug the fence line, waiting lazy for a feed bucket like common livestock. Instead, they dug deep. They roamed. They tore through the leaf litter and mountain brush exactly the way a wild hog does when given half a chance. They hunted down those fallen apples, munching through dried pumpkin vines she'd hauled from her garden and tossed along the hillside, and Lord did they feast. She watched them, her mind drifting to old Voss, and she thought hard about fat. A hog that works for a living, she figured, Just trusting her own two eyes instead of some textbook builds its muscle a whole lot differently than a lazy, penned-up grain eater. The fat marble's different. Fat on those standard grain-fed animals was just soft and tasteless. Her daddy's almanac mentioned this briefly in a dusty chapter about old frontier farming wisdom. A little note about animals foraging wild on acorns and orchard scraps. She'd underlined it. And the fresh buttermilk she scored from Pearl. 2 gallons daily mixed with foraged pumpkins and tough winter turnips from her garden, fed out in the late afternoon shadows when the herd trotted down the mountain. It sure wasn't enough to fatten them up fast. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to build something better. She couldn't rightly put it into words yet, but she felt it in her bones. Now stick with me here. That gut feeling only comes from watching the land for a long, quiet time, never rushing the final harvest. The first fella brave enough to talk auction business straight to her face was a man named Garrett Spears. He ran 200 head of cattle on the Eastern Flats and fancied himself the supreme judge on anything involving ranching and dirt. He rode his truck up her dusty road on a crisp Thursday morning, second week of October. Gather round, friends. He came by claiming he just needed a post hole digger. Elena obliged, silent. While she fetched that iron from the old barn, he leaned on the fence, eyeing the lower pasture and the slope where the herd grazed that morning. "Heard you bought Pruitt's culls," he said. "Sure did," Elena replied. "What's your plan for 'em?" "Smoke them." The man fell dead quiet. "You know what Pruitt got at the rendering house. $1.50 each. You paid $2. "I know I did." He hoisted that heavy digger onto his shoulder. Then he gave her that cautious sizing up look men often threw her way. Not talking down exactly, just treading lightly, deciding if they had the grit to speak their mind out loud. "Elena," he warned, "those animals will chew through all your winter savings long before January hits. They're doing just fine on forage." He stared at that empty lower pasture, then at her. "Forage," he repeated, spitting the word out like plain nonsense. "In October. Slopes are full of oak mast and fallen apples. Plenty of feed." "You cannot finish a hog on dropped apples." "I'm not aiming to finish them fast." That stalled him entirely. He studied her right then, his mind clearly turning gears, trying to decipher her trail but losing the tracks. How long then? Springtime mostly, few by early winter. You could see the harsh math calculating across his weathered face. That means 6 long months of feed. Give or take. He breathed out slow. "I'll return this digger Saturday," he grumbled, tramping down the dirt road. She watched his dust, feeling that familiar, hollow lonesome of riding a trail that makes perfect sense to your own soul, but looks like pure madness to every other cowboy around. Wasn't a bad feeling, truthfully. It just cleared her vision. It proved she was charting territory no one else dared to cross, which she figured was the only way to strike the gold she was hunting. Come early November, she fired up that smokehouse, not with her own herd, yet they needed time, but with practice, cuts. She traded hard labor 2 valleys over, bringing home 3 racks of ribs and a pair of small hams. Standard grain-fed stock, perfect for testing her pioneer methods. Now that old smokehouse was built with 2 separate chambers. Her daddy designed it so, though he rarely sparked the second one. Each side had fire trenches carved below, funneling up through fieldstone to the rafters. The whole trick was keeping the flames well distanced from the hanging meat, ensuring that smoke drifted in cool, keeping the heat low and steady for a good long spell. Low. And mighty slow. Long. She began with hickory, exactly how the old-timers taught her. It was a sturdy, reliable kind of smoke. A bit sharp, though. She reckoned it overpowered the meat when running hot. It left a harsh, bitter dust on the tongue. So she tamed it down, using split apple wood she'd scavenged straight from the old orchard's trimmings. Her mama hoarded those dry logs for years, far too precious for a simple kitchen stove. That campfire pairing changed everything. It mellowed out the hickory's rough bite, adding a sweet, faint, fruity trail. You and I know that kind of subtle flavor. She logged every detail into a little rawhide journal her daddy once used to track the ranch's field records. She tracked timber ratios, gauging the fire's heat by pure instinct, jotting down chamber dampness, salt rubs, and precise timing. She marked her winning hands and her busts knowing a harsh. Failure teaches you far more than any easy success. A bitter, over-smoked ham taught her more than a perfect cut. For curing, she studied the old farmer's almanac. Heavy salt, brown sugar, cracked pepper, and a pinch of homegrown dried sage. She hand-rubbed those cuts, coating every single edge, wrapping them tight in cloth, to rest on the bottom shelves for a dry cure before hitting the smoke. She wrangled the timing of each step through pure grit, trial and error. Picture standing in a freezing smokehouse at midnight with a rusty lantern, listening to what the meat had to say. Now, it wasn't flawless. That first heavy run turned out rough, way too salty on the crust. Smoke biting too hard because she misread that eastern prairie wind. She chewed some herself, tossing the scraps to her hound, Pearl, who swallowed it down without a fuss. But that second round was better, and the third, golden. Come mid-November, she'd finally wrestled that routine into something she could track steady in her ledger. She figured it weren't quite perfect yet. She reckoned she'd be tinkering with it for years, but it was sturdy enough to trust, and that meant everything. Her big gamble demanded absolute, rock-solid consistency. Every sundown, that herd drifted off the ridge, carrying the scent of brittle leaves, frost, and the faint sweet tang of dropped apples. Those pigs had settled into the rhythm. The elder sows carried themselves with a surprising, quiet kind of grit, a calm that those penned-up grain pigs simply never showed. She wasn't entirely certain if that piece would translate into the final cure, but she firmly believed it would. She didn't have fancy science to back it, just a deep-in-the-bones conviction. Whatever a creature ate and breathed would eventually weave right into the fat, the muscle, and the flavor. And this herd was living wild and deliberate for a good reason. She inspected their condition every single week. They weren't shooting up fast. They grew, like an old homesteader's garden, taking their sweet time building real heavy density. The fat layering up their spines felt entirely different under her palms than regular grain-fed livestock. It was tight, firm, unyielding. Whether this was the prize she was chasing, she wouldn't know till slaughter and butchering time. Still, every little sign pointed straight toward the heritage meat she wanted. On the good days, she'd let herself believe she had it figured out. But the bad days, when the bitter frost bit down hard and her split timber vanished far too fast, and the creek locked up in solid ice, and she lost 2 hours busting ice at the troughs. Though, days made her fear that even if her craft was flawless, the wider world might not give a damn. Fine curing without a paying buyer is just a lonely victory. She needed folks to discover this ranch. Buyers who gave a damn about the craft, not just the lowest price tag. She had no promises out there. Just an old hotel supplier clipping from 4 years back with fading prices and contacts that might be long gone dead. What she did have was the rich scent of hickory smoke inside cold stone. And she had 47 aging sows roaming a jagged ridge that the whole valley had long since abandoned. You and I know nights like that. She huddled by the stove, borrowing heat off Pearl through the barn wall, staring hard at her worn ledger and those unforgiving numbers, thinking about her old man stacking that smokehouse stone by stone, doing it with a fierce care he probably couldn't have explained himself, building it like he knew it'd matter one day. She reckoned he was dead right about this rugged slope. "I won't be wrong about this either," she swore. Out in the dark, winter's first true snow was quietly claiming Broken Ridge, falling silent and heavy, burying the grazing lands, the steep incline, the forgotten orchard, and the thick roof of that old stone smokehouse. A place that stood patient, freezing, and purely ready for this exact showdown. The blizzard that hit Broken Ridge late that November simply refused to quit. It battered the homestead in endless driving waves. A brutal day of blinding white, a cruel pause, then another hammering. It piled high until the lower corral showed nothing but top rails, leaving a trail to the smoker that Elena had to fiercely carve out fresh every single dawn with her boots and spade. She'd pushed the herd under a makeshift lean-to, rigged off the main barn using salvaged lumber and heavy beaten canvas scraps. It sure wasn't pretty, or overly warm by fancy standards, but it blocked that biting gale and trapped the raw, steaming body heat those animals threw off. 47 hogs crammed tight in a space thick with the heavy scent of wet straw, and that dense, musky livestock warmth. Elena had known since childhood something she found, truth be told, a whole lot more comforting than she'd ever confess. She fought through those 11 punishing days on a relentless, sleepless grind, up long before dawn, busting the troughs, slinging feed from the dwindling winter cache. She stretched the buttermilk with coarsely ground pumpkin and the very last of the dropped apples she'd sliced and strung up across the barn loft back in October, hanging there like pale paper moons. Now listen. She ran those feed numbers against the winter calendar 3 times over, and the grim math never flinched. She had enough to scrape by, barely, if careful. If this deep freeze dragged on, she'd be forced to buy pricey grain, and her entire homestead gamble would shatter to dust. So she was careful. Curing work never stopped for the blizzard, because that thick-walled smokehouse didn't give a damn about the roaring sky. Inside that stone, Elena controlled the heat. She mastered the hickory smoke, and the wild frontier outside could just howl all it wanted. Come mid-December, she started working the first real herd of her own stock. She pulled her 2 heaviest sows in early, washed them like a hawk for 6 weeks, deciding they'd finally hit that perfect curing condition. Slaughter and the early butchering. She handled it all firsthand, just like she learned. No fuss, no shaking hands. This was frontier work. She just did it. Curing took 2 full weeks before firing the smokehouse. Salt rubbed, wrapped, tight shelved. Checked on 'em every single sunrise. She'd feel that slow change under her calluses, the meat turning from soft to something fierce, firm, and concentrated. On day 9, she unwrapped a ham, pressed her thumb in, and felt something deeply satisfying. You and I know that feeling of hard-earned perfection, a deep, heavy density. Knew deep in the muscle things were curing exactly right. Then came the fire. She'd dialed in her wood ratio during those early practice runs, 2 parts heavy hickory to 1 part sweet applewood, fist-sized chunks only. Fed slow and steady into that firebox every 3 hours on the dot. She hunted a steady heat, reading a little copper thermometer she'd bartered some fixed-up leather harness for down at Old Fenwick's Mercantile. Best piece of frontier gear she owned. She chased a heat range she'd scratched right into that brass casing with the sharp blade of her own pocket knife. Run too hot, the meat seals up against the smoke. Run too cold, the whole curing trail just stalls out dead. First night she fed that fire. Through pitch black, catching sleep in 2-hour spells on a busted cot dragged right to the smokehouse door, wrapped tight in her mama's wool blanket. Waking just to throw wood, check that dial, and scribble in her ledger by flickering lantern light. Hour 14. Heat holding steady. Smoke color looking pure, thin blue, never white. Her old man always preached that white smoke was lazy smoke, meant a dirty burn that just chokes the meat instead of soaking deep into it. She never fully grasped his wisdom until taking on this harsh frontier trade herself. Now she watched that thin blue ghost rise through the floorboards and drift straight out the chimney top. She finally understood it. The kind of Western wisdom you only get by earning it. Come dawn on the 4th day, that smokehouse carried a scent that stopped her dead in her tracks for a long second. It just smelled right. Took her back to 12 years old, remembering that prize ham her daddy brought home, Mama slicing it thin with just simple bread. Smelled like true frontier craftsmanship. Built with the kind of patient, grueling attention Most folks just ain't tough enough to stick with anymore. She carved a paper-thin slice from her test batch, chewed it slow, right there in the freezing doorway, fresh snow piled high on her heavy work boots. She lingered a long while after swallowing. Then she turned her boots back inside and scratched a note in her worn little ledger. Batch 1. Spot on. January rode in brutally cold. Creek froze solid as stone for the first time in 3 years, choking off the mountain passes for 2 straight weeks. Starved the town of Durance from any regular wagon freight, forcing the entire rugged settlement to hunker down. Just like remote frontier outposts always do when winter demands a standstill, folks looked after neighbors. Firewood got traded. The mood was polite, but mostly that gritty civility born from shared Western misery rather than true campfire warmth. Elena didn't waste that isolation. She worked 4 more batches that January, honing her craft along the way. She gambled with her salt ratios on 2 separate batches, going a hair lighter on one and a bit heavier on the other. She realized her old recipe was close, but just too heavy-handed. That salty crust was hiding a delicate pasture flavor she desperately wanted to keep alive. She tweaked it, wrote it down, and fired again. Her little herd down 2 fat hogs now fell into a quiet winter rhythm. Whenever the sun burned hot enough to open those barn doors, she'd drive 'em up that lower mountain slope for an hour. Wasn't about digging up frozen forage anymore, seeing as snow buried everything. It was purely about keeping those animals moving. Stick with me here. She swore that mountain exercise built marbled fat you just couldn't fake in a cramped pen. The heavy muscles stretched across their shoulders and haunches carried a wild toughness you simply don't find in lazy farm-fattened stock. Whether her cowboy logic was completely dead on didn't matter. What truly mattered was the rock-solid consistency her own 2 eyes were proving. Most nights, she was surviving on barely 4 hours of restless sleep. She kept quiet about the harsh grind, since you and I know there was nobody around to listen anyway. Pull up a chair, friends. She'd just echo her old man's frontier wisdom whining about necessary chores just burns the very grit you need to actually get them done. She only ate when her belly hollered, which surely wasn't often. She milked old Pearl strictly on time, or that cow would surely raise a fuss. And she faithfully fed the flames in both the cabin and that working smokehouse through those bitter January nights. She studied her ledger and thermometer, finally grasping the true frontier craft of what she was desperately trying to build. Come the 2nd week of January, old Garrett Spears wandered back up the trail. Didn't have the post-hole digger he'd already handed back weeks prior. Trudging up alone on his own 2 boots told Elena everything before he even crossed the yard. Out west, a walking man comes to jaw, not to trade. She was swinging a heavy axe beside the cabin when she spotted him hiking up that dusty track. She kept swinging wood until he stood right in speaking distance. "Morning," he grunted. "Morning." Garrett eyed the barn, then stared at the smokehouse, watching a thin wisp of blue smoke drift lazily from the chimney cap. "That rig running?" "Has been for weeks." "What are you smoking?" "Hamside's tweaking a bacon cure." He stood quiet. Out here, rugged men like Garrett used plain silence as heavy punctuation. "Smells like something," he finally muttered. "I'd sure hope so." "No." He shook his weathered head. "I mean, it smells like something mighty specific. Caught the scent all the way down at the creek crossing." Elena dropped her heavy tools and shot him a hard look. "What are you after, Garrett?" The old rancher actually had the grace to look squirmy. "Just wondering if you're gonna survive out here," he said. "Ain't trying to pry none. Wife's cousin runs a freight wagon out of Laramie. She desperately needs a steady meat supplier for those fancy frontier hotels she supplies. Mentioned you back in November, but she ain't hauling a wagon up this ridge for just an empty promise." Elena sized him up. "You pitched me in November. Said some lone woman on Broken Ridge was cooking up a crazy venture. She took the bait. Why keep quiet?" He just shrugged. "Kept my mouth shut till I figured your little outfit was actually worth running my jaw about. A greener gal might be mad. She just knew this harsh country too well." "She hunting for big volume?" She wants quality first, volume second. Fancy hotels demand steady flavor. Elena eyed her smoking rig. She pondered her little ledger, the 4 heavy batches she'd smoked, and how beautifully those last 2 turned out, compared to the messy first. When's she rolling through town? Late February, if the mountain pass thaws. Tell her to ride up. Spears nodded, throwing another glance at the smokehouse. It actually tastes as fine as it smells down the road. Better, Elena fired back. He nearly cracked a smile. Barely a grin, really, just a shift in his weathered face, showing he actually believed the gal and was mighty shocked by it. He spun around and ambled down the dusty trail, Elena watching sharp until his shadow vanished past the creek bend. And then she hoisted her heavy maul right back up, finishing her wood splitting, knowing those hungry flames wouldn't feed themselves. Now stick with me here. Late January brought Calla Birch shocking Elena, since Calla hadn't braved that rough Broken Ridge road since Elena's poor mother passed. She rolled up, driving a buckboard cart, packing sacks of flour, dried beans, and a heavy tin of white lard. She slammed it on Elena's wooden table with the cold, matter-of-fact grit of a pioneer woman refusing to explain her charity. "How's the livestock?" Calla barked. "Good. Butchered 2 for meat. Running 45 total." "You're losing flesh, girl." It surely wasn't a question. Calla packed hawk eyes and the ruthless honesty of a gal who'd run a frontier trading post for 20 years. No time for beating around bushes. Elena knew her ribs were showing. Her heavy wool coat hung loose, and she'd carved a fresh notch in her leather belt, just figuring nobody in the valley had noticed. "I'm eating fine," Elena argued. "Not enough," Calla snapped. "Sit down, I'm cooking." "Calla, I don't need." "I didn't ask what you need, girl." "Sit." Elena collapsed in the chair. Old Calla commandeered the room with the smooth efficiency of a gal used to running strange homesteads. She rustled up tools without a word, firing up the cast-iron stove with something that quickly smelled like a real hearty meal. You know that rich, warm scent Elena's lonely cabin hadn't held it in ages. "Whispers are flying around town," Calla muttered, keeping her back totally turned to Elena. "I imagine you have. Most of it isn't flattering." "I know. Vern Hobbs at the feed store is taking bets on whether you make it to March with the herd." She held her tongue a second. "He's giving good odds against." "What odds?" 3 to 1 you fail." Elena just let that hang in the cold air. "Who's betting on me?" Calla turned right around. "I am," she said. $20. Elena just stared at her. Calla had already turned back to the iron stove. "That's on top of the 60 I owe," Elena said. "I'm aware." "Why?" Calla set a warm plate on the pine board and sat directly across from her. "Because I've been selling provisions to homesteaders in this valley for 20 years, she said. "And I've watched most of them make the exact same choices everybody else makes. Buy what everybody buys, raise what everybody else raises, sell right when everybody sells for the exact same prices." She folded her hands on that timber table. "You are not doing what the rest are doing. In my experience, that either ends in total ruin or in something truly worth watching. And you have your daddy's way of doing things slow and quiet and right." She tapped the wood once. "Eat." Elena finally took a bite. You and I both know frontier pride. It was the finest meal she'd had in 3 weeks, but she kept quiet so Calla wouldn't fuss. They talked ranching and the new smokehouse. Elena showed her the notebook. Calla fired off sharp questions about meat volume pricing and planned rates, and Elena answered every single one, crunching the homestead math together at that table. The iron stove ticked away, while the harsh winter afternoon faded into gray outside the glass. Calla possessed a sharp pioneer business mind that stretched way past her mercantile counter. Elena always knew that, but rarely saw it unleashed like this. "You're underestimating what you can actually charge," Calla pointed out later. "I don't want to overprice and scare off my first buyers. You will not lose folks who brave a frozen February road for premium smoked ham. The question isn't if they will pay. The trick is setting a price that tells them exactly what kind of quality they are getting. She locked eyes with Elena. If you charge what that cheap rendering house product fetches, you're telling folks this is the same low-grade meat. It is not. Price it higher. Elena chewed on those words long after Calla hitched up and left. She was still thinking on it while checking the smokehouse that freezing evening, standing in the warm, cedar-scented dark, thermometer in hand. That rich blue smoke curled nice and slow right over those heavy, hanging racks of pork. She recalled the hotel supplier advertisement she had carried in her heavy coat pocket for 4 whole months. The prices printed on it were for top-tier goods the ad had promised. Premium cured pork from outfits delivering a truly consistent, distinctive flavor. She'd been viewing her ranch as a desperate homestead barely surviving. Calla was pushing her to see herself as a downright premium Western enterprise. She pulled that little ledger from her pocket and scratched a brand new number at the top of a blank page. 1 price for the smoked ham, 1 for a side of bacon. Let's look closely here, folks. She studied those numbers a good long while, standing alone with the deep heat, the thick hickory smoke, and the sweet apple wood. Underneath all that was something richer, something she forged from scratch on a rugged hillside that everyone else had totally written off. She did not erase those numbers. February rolled in freezing, then unexpectedly broke wide open during its second week. 3 straight days above freezing turned the mountain pass into thick mud, but it finally opened the trail. And on one quiet Wednesday afternoon, Elena glanced up from the icy water trough to spot an unfamiliar heavy wagon rolling slowly up her muddy track. The woman working the reins looked about 40. She had broad shoulders and the wind-burned face of a seasoned trail traveler. She halted her team at the fence, eyeing the smoking cedar shed before she even looked at Elena. "You're the one Garrett Spears wrote to me about," the stranger stated. It definitely was not a question. "He wrote you. Sent a letter in January. Told me to ride up Broken Ridge Road and just follow the smell." She hopped right down into the mud without any invitation. "I am Messa Dulaine. I provision 4 bustling hotels between here and Laramie, plus 1 down in Cheyenne." She marched through the wooden gate, extending a firm hand, and Elena shook it. Dulaine possessed the rough iron grip of someone who never faked hard work. "I want to see the operation." So Elena showed her. She revealed the herd the winter feed program, the slope, and the new smokehouse. She showed her the notebook. Dulaine scoured those handwritten pages exactly then, way she'd comb through a tight Western supply ledger, reading every single detail, fast-firing off razor-sharp questions about smokehouse wood ratios, exact curing times, and her proprietary salt formulas. "Mind if I taste some?" Dulaine asked, though it sure wasn't much of a question. Elena carved a few pieces off the fresh weekly batch. She spread those slices right on her late daddy's wooden board, then stepped away. Dulaine chewed that first piece mighty slow, took another, then just stood there, staring hard down at that oak board for a good long while. "What's your price per ham?" she asked. Elena gave her the figure she'd penned down. Dulaine didn't flinch, didn't even haggle. "Need 8 hams and 6 sides monthly come March if you can handle the load," Dulaine told her. "I can," Elena said. "Can you grow it?" Elena pictured that empty second room in her old smokehouse. She pictured her livestock still wandering free up on that rugged mountain slope. 45 head left, plus the curing schedule she'd been mapping out. By summer, Elena reckoned. Not a day sooner. Dulaine nodded. "March then. 8 and 6. The buyer pulled a worn notebook, jotting a line. "I will send my wagon. Cash on the barrel upon delivery." She snapped the book shut. "Hunted for this exact quality for 2 long years," she muttered. Her voice was dead serious, not a lick of show to it. "Folks claim they make craft goods, but usually it is just average meat dressed up with a tall tale." "Then what am I making?" Elena asked. She wasn't playing games. She honestly needed to know how a stranger saw her work. Dulaine just stared toward the smokehouse. "Tastes like somebody actually gave a damn," the woman answered. "That is rarer than gold." Took off an hour later, rumbling down that muddy trail toward the pass. Elena leaned on the rail fence, watching the dust settle. She lingered there a good spell, catching her breath in the quiet before diving back into the hard labor. A bitter chill rolled in at sundown. February always steals back any warmth it offers. She stoked the smokehouse fires, inspected her hanging meat, and scribbled in her logs. Meanwhile, the winter snow started up outside, soft and steady, burying the deep ruts that wagon left in the mud, blanketing the steep slope, the quiet orchard, and the ridge, hiding everything that was still just trying to grow. Come the first Thursday of March, Dulaine's men showed up driving a covered freight wagon pulled by 2 sturdy horses. And he did not ride alone. He brought a helper along. Told Elena right then that her buyer knew this heavy load of cured pork would demand 2 strong pairs of hands. 8 hams sat wrapped tight, in cloth, resting inside salt-lined crates she built from scrap wood. 6 heavy bacon sides lay flat between waxy paper she bartered from Calla. The hired driver counted the crates, signed that receipt right off, and passed her an envelope holding the full cash payments before a single box hit the wagon bed. She planted her boots in the dirt, clutching that paper envelope, kept her eyes fixed on them rolling down the trail, refusing to peek until they vanished completely. Wasn't trying to be theatrical. She just needed a quiet minute, alone with whatever lay inside, before the truth of it set in. The cash inside matched their handshake deal down to the very last dollar. She walked indoors and stashed those bills deep inside a tin lockbox hidden beneath her wooden floorboards. Then she just stood right there in her kitchen, completely frozen for a spell. Pearl lowed out in the barn. The old wood stove needed feeding. 4 different batches of meat hung in the smokehouse, waiting on her watchful eye. She pitched wood in the fire, inspected the cuts, and got back to the grind. Lord. March flew by faster than any month she remembered. That first payout set a working rhythm she honestly hadn't seen coming. Knowing a real wagon with a solid order was rolling up come month's end, it gave those cold daily chores a sharp purpose her blind winter guessing never had. She was racing the clock now. Found herself a true customer who paid cash without crying and promised to return. That shifted how she looked at things. Focused her mind like a rifle sight, giving her pure drive instead of crushing panic. She pulled 3 more wild hogs off that mountain as March dragged on, picking them out just as careful as those first 2, judging their rough coats, feeling the dense fat along their backs, and measuring the raw power in their hams. She finally knew exactly what to look for when eyeing up a beast, even if she couldn't explain the mystery to you or me in simple words. It was magic, born from their hard, roaming, wild roots, and the rich buttermilk and dried apples she fed them all winter long. She just felt it in her bones. Handled enough rough meat by now that her calloused hands and sharp eyes just knew the truth on instinct. That old smokehouse never slept. Now she'd finally wrestled that chamber temperature down. She wasn't waking up every 2 hours through the bitter night anymore. She'd learned to read a fire the way a tracker reads a trail. A careful stoking before midnight would hold steady through the pitch black. Come 4 in the morning, she'd find that heat sitting exactly where she needed it. You and I know those 4 a.m. checks were often her finest hours. Out on the plains, a smokehouse at 4 in the morning is dead still. Outside, it's frozen dark. Inside, it's warm, heavy with that rich wood smoke scent she'd been chasing for months. And she'd just stand in that quiet, listening to the hot fire breathing right through the stone channels beneath the floor. She felt in her bones, without proving it to anyone, that this was perfectly right. Then the tail end of March dragged in something totally unexpected. Dulaine's driver rolled up for the second haul, handed over her cash plus a folded note in Dulaine's own scrawl. Elena read it right there in the dusty yard. It read, "Got a serious inquiry from Murchison Hotel Supply up in Casper after that last run. Seems their buyer tasted your smoked ham down at the Frontier House in Laramie. He's asking about your supply. He's riding through Durance around the 15th. I warned him you weren't some massive meatpacking outfit. He told me he didn't give a damn about size. Quote, I would drive to the edge of the earth for provisions that taste like that. Elena read those words twice over. She folded the paper tight, slipping it into her heavy coat pocket beside her ledger. Then she marched off to find Garrett Spears. She found him out in the barn, mending saddle tack. He looked up, wearing the face of an old rancher who knew a storm was coming, just not exactly when it would hit. Dulaine just wrote me, Elena said. Casper hotel buyer arrives in April. Spears dropped the leather harness. That is fast. Faster than I figured on. She leaned hard on the barn door. My current setup handles Dulaine's monthly run fine, but I can't supply a second big buyer at scale, not from a single chamber. He was quiet, turning it over. That second chamber in your daddy's old smokehouse needs a proper fitting. Fresh iron rods clear the vents, dig out that floor channel. Week of hard labor, maybe more. That's doable. The real burr in the saddle is livestock. She'd already crunched those hard numbers, walking over. It's exactly why she marched straight to his barn instead of stewing on it alone. I've got 38 hogs left. I fire up 2 chambers full bore. I'll burn through that livestock way faster than a spring calf can grow. I need more pigs, same exact quality, same age bracket. Spears gave her a long, hard look. You want to buy cold-breeding sows again. Same breed, same shape. Many as I can haul before those spring auctions dry up. Folks around the valley will know your game this time. I know it. The asking price won't be as friendly. I know that too. She'd already factored the gouging in. I can stomach a steeper per-head cost with Dulaine's volume assuming that second. Chamber fires up, and Casper signs a proper contract. She held her breath a second. There's a whole lot of ifs roaming around that sentence. Sure are, he muttered. He grabbed that leather harness again. Not to patch it, just needing the familiar weight in his calloused hands. I've got 8 older sows I meant to auction come May. They're yours for $350 a head if you're taking them today. Elena stared a hole through him. Why? He just shrugged, which ain't a light thing for a stubborn man like Spears. Out here, that means a man made a tough call he ain't exactly proud to talk to death about. Because my wife's cousin rode back from Laramie. Said there were 3 fellas nearly coming to blows over your last 2 hams at the Frontier House last Saturday night. He laid that heavy harness back down. I was dead wrong back in October. Not about those sows being culls. They were culls. I was wrong about what that meant in your hands. Elena didn't say a word. She respected the truth of it too much to speak quick, and she sure wasn't going to perform cheap gratitude. $350 is fair, she said. I'll take them. Now listen here. Getting that second chamber running took 9 brutal days, not 7. It dragged on because by day 4, she found an 18-inch crack slicing right down a stone floor channel. That nasty split was sucking in cold frontier drafts, completely wrecking her precious heat distribution, which perfectly explained why that damn second chamber always ran so wild for her father. She patched that thing herself using fresh mortar, a miserable chore that meant laying flat against freezing stone with nothing but a lantern and a trowel. She blindly packed that crack by feel in the dark, cramped dirt, but she did it absolutely right, which meant moving agonizingly slow. Her spine ached for 3 straight days. The iron rods she finally ordered over at Callis's store, who fetched them straight from the Durant blacksmith. Let me tell you about Orrin Falk. He was a meticulous blacksmith, taking that iron commission seriously, grilling Elena on load-bearing limits harder than she'd figured. Elena answered every single question. Those iron rods came out flawless. By the time that second smoke chamber was running, April's second week rolled around, bringing that Casper meat buyer, fella named Whitmore. He rode for a Western supply outfit called Murchison Provisions, pulling in exactly 3 days later. He looked younger than Elena figured, maybe 35, stepping with a careful, deliberate grace. He had a sharp focus she recognized right away, possessing it herself. This man wasn't just faking an inspection. He was studying every single detail. They walked that rugged slope in quiet. He just watched her livestock push through wet spring grass and fading dirty snow. He inspected her whole feeding rig without a single word. 15 whole minutes he spent inside that smokehouse, outlasting Dulaine, and he scoured her ranching ledger deeper than anyone alive besides Calla. "Can I ask you something?" Whitmore said, standing straight in the smokehouse ledger flipped wide open. "Go right ahead." "This forage program, the herd movement, these exact wood-smoke ratios?" He glanced up from those pages. "Did you build this system yourself?" "From observation and plain failure. There is absolutely no written guide for this method, not any I've ever found." He shut the book real careful and passed it back. "My hotel clients are in Casper, Cheyenne, and one down in Denver. That Denver outfit is the only one I care about for this talk." He laid it out flat, without any smooth talk or build-up. Elena respected that completely. "Their kitchen boss wants a steady supply of premium smoked pork, something that sets their dining menu apart from every other saloon and steakhouse. I've hauled him 6 different meat products from 6 separate ranch operations over 2 years. He turned down every single one." Elena waited. "I want to ship him a sample from this batch before committing to a massive order," Whitmore declared. "If he bites like I expect, I'll return within 3 weeks, packing a signed contract." "What kind of volume?" He stated a number monthly steady, nearly double what Dulaine was buying. Elena kept her expression stone cold. Inside, though, she was doing fast pioneer math about her livestock, her smoke chambers, meat curing timelines, and the sheer physical limits of producing out here with just 2 ovens burning at absolute maximum capacity. The quota was achievable, but just barely. And only if disaster stayed away, the herd stayed healthy, and the fires burned true. "I can meet that by July," she said. "Not before." "July works." He cast one more slow look around that smokehouse. "I will share something I rarely tell agriculture suppliers," he muttered. "I've worked this rugged trade for 11 long years. I know what cheap meat dressed up with a tall tail smells like. I know exactly what adequate smells like. The meat hanging in these chambers doesn't smell like either of those things." He grabbed his dusty hat off the wooden shelf where it rested. "Send that sample out on Delaney's next delivery run. You will have my answer within a month." He rode off, leaving the dusty afternoon dead quiet behind him. Elena just stood there in the center of that smokehouse for a real long stretch, and then she slumped down to the dirt floor, just sat right on the freezing stone, tipped her weary head back against the timber wall and closed her eyes. Not just from pure exhaustion, though her bones ached, but from something without a simple name. The crushing, accumulated weight of every single choice since October, every lonely night, packing the lantern thermometer and ledger. Every freezing dawn spent smashing thick ice in the livestock trough. Stubborn conversation where she held her ground while folks stared like she was steering a wagon straight off a slow, inevitable cliff. She rested there for maybe 5 minutes. Then she pulled herself up, because on a homestead, fires always need tending. Now stick with me, because here is the twist. What she never told Whitmore Dulaine, or a single living soul, was a herd problem brewing since February. A nasty threat she hadn't solved. Deep in the late winter cold, 3 of her hogs had shown dangerous signs of respiratory sickness. Not deadly, not spreading, but stubbornly present. She had quarantined them away from the main group. That separation heavily cost her tight feeding logistics and forced her to build a secondary holding pen. She hammered it together one freezing February afternoon, using scavenged timber from the ruined old hay shed. Those sick hogs finally recovered, but that scary episode revealed the massive, glaring vulnerability in her solitary frontier operation. She was running aging livestock through a brutal winter on an untested feeding strategy. The High Plains climate showed zero mercy. She was doing this totally alone, without an inch of margin for a genuine health crisis. She desperately needed hired hands. She'd known it for weeks. You and I both know how it goes. Folks who build an empire with their bare hands stubbornly resist the hard truth that they can't carry the load forever alone. Now, her reluctance wasn't exactly pure pride, but it was near enough to it. Out here, stubbornness takes a heavy toll before you finally swallow it and ask for a hand. She set her sights on Iris Vane, a tough woman living 2 miles up the valley from the Holloway spread, with her 14-year-old girl, Petra. Iris lost her husband the year prior. Poor fella fell through the creek ice during an early thaw and didn't turn up until the spring melt. Since then, she managed their little sheep operation all by her lonesome, holding steady. Elena caught sight of her at the Durance market twice that winter. Iris had the look of a homesteader who was keeping her head above water, but just barely. She held it together with that bone-deep exhaustion you only see in folks refusing to quit. Out west, talk is cheap. Elena chewed on her words and figured plain, blunt honesty was the only trail to take. She rode out a mid-April Saturday morning, waiting until the spring mud baked hard enough so the wagon trail wouldn't get completely torn to pieces. Iris opened up with flour dusting her hands, wearing that sharp glare of a ranchwoman interrupted right in the middle of her necessary chores. "Elena Holloway," she said, not hostile, but sure lacking any frontier hospitality. They knew each other from passing glances and the quiet gossip folks share about neighbors they rarely sit by the fire with. "I need a hand," Elena told her plainly. "I can pay cash. Let me pitch what I'm building and what I'm lacking." Iris sized her up for a long, quiet second, then finally stepped back from the heavy door. She stood aside. Elena laid it out at the table while young Petra sat quiet in the corner, faking a mending job, but soaking up every single word being spoken. She detailed her herd, the grazing plan, the smokehouse, and her outstanding beef orders. Then Elena laid her cards on the table about what she required, needing a steady hand 3 mornings a week to drive the livestock and oversee the feeding troughs, someone who truly knew livestock well enough to spot a sickness early on. She offered a mighty fair cash wage, throwing in smoked meats and thick sides of bacon. That kind of practical bounty meant survival for a frontier family, surviving on scraps. Iris just listened like a stone. When Elena wrapped up, a heavy silence fell. "Those stock animals that fell sick back in February," she said. "What was your play?" "Quarantined, them kept close watch. They shook it off, naturally." "What caught your eye first?" Off their grain, runny noses, one kept her head hanging low. Iris gave a nod. Same story with sheep. The dropped head is always the dead giveaway. She stared at her calloused hands. "My man worked the cattle. I ran the sheep. I reckon I know livestock ailments fine." She just paused. 3 mornings a week, enough to wrangle all you're saying, coupled with my own sweat the rest of the week. Yeah, the real grit is the dawn drive and mixing the feed. I just need a second set of sharp eyes. You and I both know how frontier kids are. Iris looked at her daughter, who dropped her fake mending, shooting her mother a look, voting a loud, clear yes. Iris turned right back to Elena. "I'll be bringing Petra along," Iris declared. "She's got away with livestock and needs the labor. That suits me. But I gotta learn your methods so I can cover the herd if you take ill." "I'll teach you every bit of it." Iris reached across that timber table. They shook on it, and the deal was struck. Come daybreak, Iris and young Petra marched up the dirt trail together. Elena was already waiting out by the lean-to, and that girl walked straight up to the split-rail fence, leaning over with the kind of dead silent focus any seasoned rancher instantly recognizes as the mark of someone born to handle wild beasts. The kid fired off 3 sharp questions right out the gate, all dead practical. Elena shot straight back, and you could see Petra absorbing the wisdom before firing off her next inquiry. By the time they drove those animals up the ridge, Elena reckoned Iris hadn't exaggerated a lick about the girl's true worth. Iris herself was a silent shadow, never wasting a single ounce of sweat. She studied Elena's routine without a peep for 2 days. By the 3rd, she offered a tip on pacing the afternoon feed run that Elena tested out and found to be dead-on accurate. When the new trick worked perfectly, Iris didn't brag or boast. She just quietly penciled the change into her own logbook. Bringing her own ledger told Elena everything she needed to know about this woman's serious grit. If you've ever worked a ranch, you know having them there changed the daily rhythm. Nothing major. Pull up a chair. She still worked those smokehouse nights, dead alone, running on scraps of sleep. She still carried the crushing weight of every ranch decision. But folks, a morning hits different when you hear fresh voices and see new hands on those fence rails. Take Petra, sizing up each hog's quirks with a sharp, uncanny eye for detail. "That one," Petra said on her fourth morning, pointing out a mid-sized sow that had been lagging behind on the ridge the day before. "She's not right." Elena squinted hard. From afar, the hog looked perfectly fine. "Her back left," Petra said. "She's favoring it only a little." Elena stepped into the dirt pen. Sure enough, a small stone bruise in the left rear hoof. Nothing fatal, an easy fix. But with Elena drowning in chores, it would have gone unnoticed for days and crippled the beast. She doctored the hoof. That sow walked fine within a week. Elena didn't say a word to Petra right then. But come sundown, she sat by the smokehouse fire, thinking back to the bitter chill of February when she ran the whole outfit dead alone. How many silent disasters might have slipped right past her exhausted eyes? She had barely caught that lung sickness in time. Come late April, that second curing chamber fired up. She ran a test burn, inspected the patched floor draft, and made sure the heat settled even across both hanging racks. It worked flawlessly. Hell, it worked even better than the first rig. By now, she knew how to read a fire's soul, and those patched vents finally obeyed her every single command just right. Late April, the first double batch loaded up. She hung 32 heavy cuts of meat between the brick walls and sides, plus 3 cured jowls she figured might fetch a fair price. She checked the heavy heat and scratched the time in her ledger and stood dead still in the narrow stone alley between those two roaring chambers. Both pit fires breathing steady down below the suite, smoke rising in pale blue ghosts through the racks, heavy scents of hickory and applewood soaking every inch of the air. She thought about October. She remembered the dirty auction yard, Cobell's hammering gavel, and the cruel laughter chasing her wagon up the trail. Then she stepped into the daylight, fed the hogs, checked up on Pearl, and bolted down cold food standing at the counter, because a rancher's clock never stops ticking. Whitmore's letter finally showed up on a dusty Friday in the second week of May, hauled up the valley in Caleb Birch's supply wagon, packed alongside a heavy sack of salt and 2 pounds of dried pepper Elena desperately needed. Caleb handed the envelope over dead quiet, but her eyes tracked Elena's face closely, watching like a shrewd woman who had real skin and hard dollars riding on this whole venture. The letter was brief. Whitmore wrote exactly how he spoke. No sweet talk, no fluff. The kitchen boss at Denver's Beaumont Hotel ran the sample during a Thursday dinner rush. He served it up to 8 different tables. Before the night even ended, 4 fine dining guests demanded to know exactly where that meat came from. He wants 12 hams and 8 sides every month, looking to jump to 18 and 12 by autumn if the meat stays honest. "I'll be in Durance on the 22nd with a formal contract." Elena read it twice over, folded it, slipped it into her weathered coat. "Well?" Calla asked. "He's coming on the 22nd with a contract." Calla stood there quiet for a spell. Then she finally said, "How much do you owe me?" $60. "Pay me 40 now and keep 20. Put it into the operation." "Calla." "Don't argue with me about money, Elena. I have more practice at it than you do." She clicked at her horse, the heavy wagon rolling off down the dirt track, while Elena just stood there, clutching that letter, watching her leave. She turned back to find Iris. Iris was up on the ridge with Petra, driving the swine down through the muddy creek crossing for their afternoon meal. Now picture this. Elena reading that letter knee-deep in mud, while Petra kept the lead hog steady with the calm grit of a born rancher, and the rest of the herd bunched up, waiting with that stubborn mix of restless hunger and tired resignation. Iris handed the paper back in dead silence. She wore that guarded, squinting look that meant her brain was furiously crunching numbers. "Can we meet the volume?" Elena said. It didn't sound like much of a question. "On the current herd, if we don't take any losses, we can survive summer at Delane's rate and start building toward Whitmore's by fall. You and I know how tables turn." Iris wiped mud on her trousers. "The constraint isn't the smokehouse anymore. It's the livestock. I know. You need more breeding sows, exact same profile." "I know that too." Elena had been running that exact ranch math long before the letter showed up. She saw this coming like a summer storm. She'd been trying to brace for the sudden, heavy weight of a success that outran her whole damn supply chain. Spring livestock auctions run through June. If I ride out now, I can buy stock at fair prices before the whole county catches wind of my operation. Petra, who'd been eavesdropping quiet as a barn owl, spoke up. "Word's already out." Both women turned and stared at her. "In town," Petra said, blunt as only a 14-year-old can be before they learn to sugarcoat things. "Folks at Fenwick's General Store are talking. Mrs. Hobbs told my buddy's mom. You've got buyers riding in from Casper and Denver." She paused. Vern Hobbs at the feed store apparently lost his bet. Elena glanced at Iris. Iris just gave her that look. The exhausted look of a mother who knew her kid was dead right about local small-town gossip. "Then I've got to move fast," Elena said. She hit 3 separate cattle and swine auctions late that May. First up was Harwick's yard. You and I know how these work. She arrived at dawn to walk the holding pens before bidding opened. The shift since October was obvious. Cobble, the head auctioneer, tipped his hat and used her name. 2 local cattlemen gave her that tight nod, the begrudging respect folks offer when they realize they misjudged you, but hate admitting they were wrong. Old Delwood Pruitt, the man who sold her those first 47 sows, tracked her down at the corral rail. "Heard you've been busy up on that hillside place," he drawled. "Working at it," Elena replied flatly. He tugged on the dusty brim of his hat. "Got 14 older sows to move this June. You want first pick before the gavel drops, I'll do $4 a head." Elena held his gaze steady. Back in October, he'd sold her the herd for $2 apiece. The markup was pure frontier capitalism, and she'd planned for it. $3.50, she countered. He looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. "They're worth $4. To a stranger, maybe. To me, they're $3.50. You know I'm good for the cash today, and we both dodged the auction house commission." He chewed on that for 15 solid seconds. "Done," he said. A quick handshake sealed the deal. Next up was a small settlement called Ridgeway, 12 miles higher up the mountain valley, where she bought 11 more head. This rancher had heard rumors and pulled his stock from the general lot, gambling that she'd ride into town. He asked $4.50, and she paid it. These hogs were prime condition, far better than the usual dusty yard stock. And honestly, she didn't have time to haggle all afternoon. Plus, that livestock quality was worth every extra penny. At the third sale, she secured 9 more at $4 flat. 34 new head in 2 weeks. Her average cost per animal was sitting way higher than her autumn buy-in. The frontier arithmetic had shifted. Steady agricultural orders and the massive Whitmore contract meant she could stomach the heavy feed costs during their conditioning phase, but it was still a serious upfront gamble. Let's look at this closely. The ranch had outgrown simple mental math. It now demanded the kind of iron-fisted farm management she hadn't needed before. She sat beside Iris out on the Holloway porch on a warm, early June evening, crunching the brutal numbers together with their leather-bound ledgers flipped wide open. The setting sun cast long golden shadows across the ridge. Out there, the herd moved like a dark shadow through the scrub oak. "We need a grazing rotation," Iris noted. "New arrivals face a strict conditioning period before we turn them loose into main production. Mix the herd too early, we wreck the feed program and ruin our livestock consistency." "Agreed. 12 weeks minimum on pasture conditioning before I'll even consider them for breeding. That makes our first batch ready by September, right when Whitmore demands our major supply chain scale-up to begin." Iris scribbled a note. "That's a tightrope, real tight." Elena agreed. What if sickness sweeps the main herd before autumn hits? Then the noose pulls tighter. Elena stared out over the rugged slope. We've got Petra watching them at sunrise. We caught that hoof rot back in April before it spread. We've got our strict winter isolation pens. Not that it's an ironclad guarantee. Out here, you and I know nothing's guaranteed. Elena said it without bitterness, just cold, hard frontier reality. We wrestle what we can. And face the storm when it breaks, Iris said, snapping her ledger shut. She sat quiet a spell. Elena knew that heavy silence. It meant Iris was weighing whether to unload a burden she'd been packing around. You hear the town gossip? Iris asked. Elena figured folks were spinning a mighty different yarn than they were last October. Some of it, sure. Iris hesitated. Folks claim you just caught a lucky break, that a buyer blew into the valley right when you had stock to sell. Elena held her tongue. I just figured you ought to know the tall tale they're spinning, Iris muttered. It don't change the ranch work, but a smart hand knows which way the wind blows. Won't change how early I saddle up tomorrow, I know. Iris stood up and tucked the ledger away, exactly why I brought it up. Gossip will never spook a worker like you, but you still deserved to hear it straight. Iris headed off down the dusty trail. Elena lingered on the porch alone, watching the mountain shadows swallow up the dying light. Now you and I should chew on that word together. Luck. Sure, she caught a breeze, stumbling on that old flyer. Spears riding kin. Whitmore showing up right on time. Luck is real out here, but luck just opens the gate. You still gotta ride the bronc yourself. She headed back indoors, stoked the dying fire, and studied the grazing rotation schedule until she had memorized. Come the 22nd, that Whitmore contract rode in as promised. He showed up in person instead of sending some city clerk. Proved her hunch right. He was. A fella who trusted his own two eyes to size up a spread, not some hired hand. They pulled up chairs at the heavy kitchen table, chewing through that paperwork page by page. She had Caleb Birch review it beforehand. Callan knew her way around a thick stack of legal promises better than anybody Elena trusted, and Calla had circled two tricky clauses, one dragging on delivery blame, another on quality squabbles. Elena looked Whitmore dead in the eye about them, and he smoothed both out easy. He scratched out the delivery trap right there with his ink pen, proving he was just testing the fences to see if she would push back. The quality dispute took more careful ink, but the final deal felt square and honest. She inked her name. He folded his papers, stashed them in his bag, and studied that worn kitchen, with the exact same keen look he had out in her smokehouse last April. No slick salesman act, just raw curiosity. Mind if I ask a personal question? He said. Shoot, she told him. Why pigs out of everything? He genuinely wondered. Folks run beef in this valley. You could have too. Cattle take 3 long years to pay off, Elena fired back. I only had one winter. That's the practical truth. She weighed her deeper reason. My old man built that heavy timber smokehouse for swine. He knew the rich flavor this tough hillside could yield with the proper beast and the right cure. He just never got the chance to see it through. She caught her breath. Figured if I was going to fight to save this homestead, I ought to bet on the very thing it was built to do. Whitmore gave a slow nod. He didn't offer any weak, sentimental pity, which Elena sure respected. One last thing, he asked. This curing method you've perfected, is it all written down solid? It's in my ledger. I mean properly recorded, so the work goes on even if you bust a leg for a month. She had never quite looked at the trail ahead that way. She'd been so deep in the daily grit that the thought of this recipe surviving on its own just seemed like smoke. Not officially, no, she confessed. I highly recommend you do, he offered. No rush. Not for my sake, for yours. This meat business holds value because it's reliable, and reliability needs a written map. He got up and grabbed his valise. That fancy Denver hotel boss is named Alvarez. You and I know high praise when we hear it. Alvarez said those dining guests gave the strongest, best feedback on a new plate he's seen in 4 years. He stopped right at the threshold. Just figured you'd want the pure truth. Once his dust settled, she sat at that old timber table a good while, then fetched a brand new leather notebook. She had bought 3 from Calla, hoping she'd need them someday. She picked up a pen and started mapping out her legacy. Not the messy, blood-stained field scribbles, but a pure, clean record of the frontier. Let me tell you, running a ranch ain't just luck. Feed schedules, wood ratios, temperature limits, salt mixes, and smoke timing. Every ounce of pioneer instinct living in her calloused hands had to be put to paper so a greenhorn could follow it. Took her 4 long nights. When the ink dried, she read it all back, spotted 2 spots where she rambled, grabbed her pen and hammered down the exact details. Then she copied the whole mighty thing down, every single page by hand, right there at the kitchen table, and handed it off to Calla Birch down at the general store. "What in tarnation is this?" Calla asked. "Just in case I meet my maker and somebody needs to run this homestead." Calla gave her a hard stare. "Like what?" "Sickness, broken bones. I'm working this ridge with 2 folks and a single milk cow. If I go down for 2 weeks, this whole outfit dies." She stopped a second. "I ain't planning to fall, but I never planned on burying both my parents, neither." Calla took those papers and slid them under the counter without saying another word, but she locked eyes with Elena before turning around. That heavy stare carried something much deeper than just a plain business deal. It was 2 frontier women silently understanding the grim cost of planning for your own funeral and doing the chore anyway. June dragged out, bone dry. The ridge burned from green to a sun-baked gold, and the cattle chewed through it like clockwork. Elena started logging thick records for every single beast running in her main herd. A clever ear tag system, Iris pitched little copper clips punched into ears. She kept the numbers in a heavy ledger, tracking how every head of cattle was filling out their grazing habits and slaughter dates. It was a heap of desk work for a rancher, but that Whitmore contract demanded it. She could not afford guessing games. She needed exact dates, because that smokehouse schedule had to be ironed out weeks in advance. Young Petra practically took over the whole morning cattle drive log. She kept all those tallies in her very own pocketbook, writing down how each beast acted and looked with a sharp eye that flat out stunned Elena. That kid was spitting out words about livestock health that most gray-bearded ranchers had never even heard of. Elena started asking the girl for her honest take, no longer just playing teacher, but because those sharp eyes caught real trouble. Soon enough, Petra stopped acting shocked and just started giving straight answers. Late June, on a baking Thursday, Petra marched up to the smokehouse with a shadow over her face. "Old 31, the girl said. "She is grazing hard, but she ain't putting on meat like the rest of her herd." Elena wiped grease off her work apron. "Pull out that ledger." They hunted through the pages. The kid called it perfectly. For 3 straight weeks, that cow packed on pounds way slower than the rest of her pen, even though she was eating just fine. "She is burning energy just fighting the heat," Iris chimed in, walking up behind them. She had been listening by the fence. "Look close at her hide. It is rougher than the rest. She is sweating out her gains. This nasty June heat," Elena muttered. "She needs a lot more shade come afternoon." They tweaked the afternoon herding schedule for that specific bunch, bringing them back to the barn early. A mighty small fix for just 3 head of cattle needing extra shade, but it slapped 20 more minutes onto Petra's long day. The brave kid never complained once. Now, if you and I were watching 2 weeks later, Old 31 had chunked right up. That ranch ran tight, sharp and fast on its feet. Ain't pretty. No, sir, nothing pretty about 3 tired souls running 48 cattle across a brutal Wyoming ridge, juggling smokehouse times and pleasing buyers out in 2 different wild territories. It was brutal, back-breaking labor, and often drove you flat crazy, the way Mother Nature does when a living herd refuses to follow the neat little numbers on paper. But by God, it worked. Every single month they scraped by, patching holes and shifting plans. The beef shipped on time, the silver rolled right back in, and that heavy bank loan at Territorial Savings got chopped down in 2 massive swings. First half vanished in May. The second chunk dropped on a sunny Wednesday morning in July. You and I both know how sweet this feels. Elena marched into Durance, slapping $412 cash onto Clerk Bowman's desk. That boy counted it twice before writing her receipt. Account totally settled in full, he muttered. I know, Elena said. She shoved the receipt in her coat next to her notebook, stepping out into that hot July morning. You know that feeling she expected? It never really came. All winter she figured clearing that debt would feel like finally dropping a heavy pack she'd hauled for miles and just plumb forgot about. Truth is, it just felt like crossing off one chore at the top of a mighty long trail of hard work ahead. So she went back to work. Now folks around the valley started talking to her differently. It crept up so slow she never caught it happening all at once. It was just a trail she recognized, looking back across that whole long summer. Garrett Spears quit handing down advice and actually started asking for her consultation. A quiet shift, sure, but clear as day. Those cattlemen at the June livestock auction who sold her stock, they never haggled. 2 of those boys actually sought her out first. Come July, a lady she hardly knew, the wife of a local cattle boss named Forsyth, who ran a huge spread 20 miles south, flagged her down at the Durance market. She asked, real polite, if Elena had the room to take on some extra breeding sows come fall. Could be, Elena replied. Just depends on what exactly you're offering. The woman laid it out. Older sows, the exact same kind Elena had been pulling and getting cleared out of a grain-fed setup. 4 a head, Elena said. My husband figured $3.50. Well, he can haul them to the Casper rendering plant for $1.50. Elena said, smooth as glass, or he brings them to me for $4. The real difference is I'll take them when I'm good and ready, meaning he won't feed them all summer. The woman stared at her, chewing on something that wasn't exactly anger. Finally, she nodded. I'll tell him $4. Elena headed back to her spread and logged that possible buy in her scheduling book. But she didn't use ink. She used pencil. Because you and I know promises out here ain't real until they arrive. But walking up Broken Ridge Road that warm July evening with the baked dirt radiating, heat and thick smoke from both chambers pushing steady into the fading western sky, she realized something had finally clicked. The whole valley was catching on to her vision. Not completely, mind you, not perfectly. Some folks will always chalk a woman's success up to blind luck. They need it to be luck because the honest truth? Pure grit. Patience and precision. And being willing to fail right out in the open while figuring things out is just a heavier saddle to bear. She didn't care if they understood. She only needed her smokehouse running smooth, her livestock healthy, those contracts met on time, and her trusted crew, Iris, Petra, and in her own quiet way, Calla, to just keep pulling their weight. The rest of the noise could sort itself out. That first bitter frost of her second autumn rolled off the ridge late one October Tuesday, painting the entire rugged hillside a sparkling, icy silver by dawn. Elena was up way before sunrise, just like she'd been doing every single day for nearly a solid year now. But the feeling of those pitch-black mornings had shifted in ways she hadn't banked on. A year ago, she'd wake up practically choking on dread. Nothing flashy, just that gnawing, heavy dread of a rancher counting her last few chips and realizing she was coming up short. Now she opened her eyes to something else entirely. Something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't comfort, no, and it sure wasn't total security. It was the feeling of planting your boots on ground you've tested, knowing it's finally going to hold. She stoked the fire, brewed up some coffee, and stood by the window holding that tin cup her daddy bought down in Laramie. Iced-over glass turned the ridge into a ghost in the gray dawn. From there, she could see both smokehouse chimneys punching thick smoke straight into the freezing morning air. She'd banked those fires late the night before, packing a heavy load into both of those smoking chambers. All that hickory and applewood she'd stacked through September was burning down, now the serious lifeblood of a genuine operation. That smoke climbed dead straight in the dead-still morning air, burning thin and blue. She watched it for a minute before grabbing her coat and stepping outside. Iris and Petra were due right at 7 o'clock. They had livestock to move, plus a new feed ration she'd cooked up the night before. Winter bit down fast this year. That herd was going to need extra calories just to keep their weight up through the bitter freeze. A smart adjustment to the fall feed program, built strictly from last year's hard-earned lessons. She'd jotted that change down after supper, and now it was just about getting it done. You and I know that's what life out here becomes. Pure, relentless execution. Now, this wasn't a decline. Think of it like a frontier corral built up, tested, hard busted in places, and patched back stronger. What this ranch needed now was steady, calloused hands, not wild guesswork. Elena didn't miss the guesswork one bit. Truth is, she missed nothing about that bitter first winter, except maybe that strange feeling of standing completely alone with a wild idea she hoped might survive. You and I know frontier winters come fast. Those Forsyth sows arrived early November. 22 head, hauled by wagon from 20 miles south. They were driven by a ranch hand who looked mighty surprised to find such a tight outfit at the end of a dirt road he figured led to a dying homestead. Elena marched those hogs into the holding pen herself, eyeing every single one. She sent 2 right back onto that wagon. They didn't match the Forsyth woman's big promises, and Elena sure wasn't going to weaken her herd just to fill up space. The hand shifted, looking real uneasy about taking them back. Mrs. Forsyth won't like this. Mrs. Forsyth is welcome to haul them to the Casper rendering plant, Elena fired back, voice cold as steel, just like she told that woman at the July market. I'll pay $4 a head for 20 hogs that meet my standard. I ain't paying a dime for runts. He loaded up those 2 and left. Elena knew she'd hear about the insult soon enough, and, sure enough, word came 3 days later through Calla. Mrs. Forsyth was calling Elena impossible to work with. Calla passed this along with a sly tone, making it crystal clear she considered that reputation a high compliment out here. Those 20 kept hogs entered the conditioning cycle. Young Petra had them all logged in her ledger less than an hour after they arrived. Ear tags, weights, health notes, and their exact spot in that rotation schedule. She worked with the smooth rhythm of a rancher who trusted her own hard-earned system. She was 15 now, turned 15 back in September, walking through that operation with real authority, not empty arrogance, just solid pioneer competence, worn like an old leather jacket. Number 41 is dragging behind, Petra told Elena, looking over her own ledgers the morning after that intake. She's running about 15 pounds light for her bone structure. She needs 6 weeks to reach where the rest get in 4. Flag her in the book. Way ahead of you. Elena stared at the girl. You memorized that entire rotation calendar? I just copied it down. Petra didn't even blink or look up from her ledger like this was just common sense. Just in case you and my mother are ever tied up at once, Elena stayed quiet on that. She just turned right back to her own chores, checking over the smokehouse heat logs for the morning. But the image of that girl hunched over her notes stuck with her. Methodical, fearless, and already way sharper at 16 than any grown ranch hand she could ever hire today. Delwood Pruitt rode up that dirt trail on an early November Wednesday. Now, you and I know that out west, riding in alone means one thing. A man wants to talk plain without causing a spectacle. Elena was leaning against the fence rail. She stood her ground, making him ride all the way over instead of crossing that muddy yard. He seemed different than the fellow who sold her 47 sows at Hardwick 13 months back. Not different in how he looked exactly. He had the same dusty hat, same slow drawl, same weathered face, but his whole manner had lost that pitying, mild concern she remembered perfectly. He rode in today treating her like an equal. He knew she'd survived. and that hard truth sat on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat. "Got 30 older sows I'm cycling out of my breeding stock," he finally said, "before I haul them over to the May livestock auction. I figured I'd ask if you wanted them." Elena stared him down. "What's your asking price per head?" "Thinking $450. I'll give you 4. He just went dead quiet. "They're much better stock than what I sold you last season." "I believe it. $4. He tugged on that worn hat brim, just like he used to do. "Last October, I thought you were making the most foolish mistake I'd ever seen a girl make in 20 years of working the cattle trades. I know you did. Told my wife that very night the old Holloway land would be completely dead by spring." He paused there. "She reminded me of that last month when the supply driver passed through, mentioning your success." "What did you say?" "That I was wrong." He said it straight out, no fake apologies or wounded pioneer pride. "You and I both know decent frontiermen admit mistakes with way less noise than cowards do." $4, he said. "When do you want them delivered?" "March. I'll be ready by March." He just nodded, and they shook hands. As he rode off down Broken Ridge Road, Elena leaned on that fence, watching his dust. You might think she felt triumphant, but out here victory feels different. It was quieter. The deep satisfaction of setting the record straight rather than just besting old Pruitt. She was fixing a frontier tale told dead wrong by folks who just didn't know enough. Folks tend to judge a homestead by its cover and call it the whole truth. Honestly, she couldn't even blame them for it. Hell, seeing 47 aging sows run by a broke 27-year-old homesteader, she'd have probably figured the same. But Elena knew her land. She knew the secret of that specific hillside and her sturdy smokehouse. She asked why some cured meat carried the taste of pure memory, and her hunch on the answer turned out dead right. Asking the right question takes a little luck, sure, but the back-breaking ranch work that followed was all hers, and she knew the difference well. Come mid-November, Whitmore rode in for his quarterly visit. He liked coming out himself instead of sending some greenhorn supply rep, which was mostly because, as he put it, he viewed the Hollow operation, a name he actually coined, a title that clearly stuck as a major Western account needing top-level attention. He sat at her table with black coffee and his leather ledger crunching the fall numbers. Just as planned, the Denver hotel had scaled up their meat contract by September. Now a second Denver joint right on the main commercial drag, the fancy sort with menus printed on stiff cards instead of chalked up on slate, had sent word through the Beaumont's kitchen boss asking for a steady supply come January. What's their ask? Elena wondered. 6 hams and 4 sides every month. They want a reliable supply chain, not random orders. She quietly ran the ranch schedule through her head. Her fall herd, those Forsyth hogs, plus 12 bought at the September livestock auction, would hit the main production rotation by December and January. I can manage 4 and 3 come January, scaling to their full demand by March, she said. Not sooner. I'll promise them March for everything. Tell them January for the partial order, March for the rest, she instructed. Delivering part of it on time beats a late full shipment any day, sets the right expectation. Whitmore peered over his tin coffee cup, giving her that quiet look which passed for him being mighty impressed. It was so subtle she used to miss it entirely. That's the smart play, he agreed. Together they hammered through the remaining Western business numbers. Their total contract volume for next year across Dulane's supply route, the Denver Hotel, and the new joint, plus 2 Cheyenne hotels Whitmore roped in late summer, was far bigger than anything Elena expected when she built that second smokehouse chamber back in April. She had aimed for a steady, reliable little regional livestock operation, but what she stared down now demanded a much longer view of the horizon. I need to ask you something, she said as they closed the books. Shoot. Next year's volume, I can handle it with my current herd rotation, assuming no storms or sickness hit us out here. She took a breath. To build a true safety buffer into this supply chain, I need to grow this herd by 30%. That means buying head constantly at auction or... She cut off, or finding a steadier source. Whitmore chimed in. A reliable breeder, so you're not riding on auctions. He chewed on the thought. I supply 3 big ranches across 2 counties, running heavy breeding programs. They phase out old stock on a steady clock. If you're willing, I can make an introduction. No binding contracts, yet just a handshake meeting. You folks can hash out the actual terms. Elena sat back and chewed on what that really meant. A steady flow of hogs from established outfits meant predictable timing. It shifted her entire sourcing problem from a desperate scramble to pure strategy. Yes, she finally said. I'll take that deal. I'll send letters this week. He rode out soon after leaving Elena alone at the table with both heavy notebooks open, her muddy field journal and the official business ledgers. Staring down at those pages, you and I can see what the Hollow operation was truly becoming. Something far beyond what she'd dreamed last October. Bigger, messier, and tangled up with more folks across the frontier than she ever saw coming. Gather round. Those folks, Iris, Petra, Calla, Spears, Dulane, Whitmore, they weren't just shadows in her ranching business. They were the bedrock. Truth is, she never saw that coming. She kicked off this agricultural venture out of pure, solitary grit. Just a lone woman on a windswept hill, sweating over soil folks called dead. And yeah, it took iron stubbornness. Still took it, always would. It demanded that deep-down refusal to quit, a wildfire burning in her belly that never needed any outside tending. But the secret to actually making this farm thrive, the spark that forged a raw idea into a lasting, profitable homestead, wasn't just her digging in her heels. It was the folks who rode up right when pure grit wasn't enough. Back when she broke ground, she didn't even know how to ask for a helping hand. She had to learn it the hard way. Still was, honestly. And she reckoned that kind of trail just goes on winding forever. The moment that capped off that long year hit on a late November Saturday. Garrett. Spears trudged up the dirt road, had twisted in his hands. Now that alone was strange enough to signal heavy weather before he even touched the ranch gate. He wasn't riding solo. Flanking him were 2 cattlemen Elena knew well from the seasonal livestock auctions. One was Croft, a fellow running a decent-sized spread just east of Durance. The other was young Bale, fresh off inheriting his daddy's land and desperately trying to wrangle a future out of it. You and I have seen that look. They stood there like a stiff, squirming delegation because, well, that's exactly what they were. Iris was out in the dusty yard with Petro. She shot Elena a sharp glance that plainly said, I have no earthly idea what this posse wants, but I'm dying to know. Elena held her ground. Spears broke the silence. We've been jawing amongst ourselves, he muttered, about the valley's breeding sow market. Is that right? Elena shot back. The rendering house rate is stuck. $1.50 a head for 3 years. He paused. You're paying $4. I know my own rates, Croft barked. He was a straight shooter, mighty tired of Spears dancing around the point so slow. We need to know if you'll buy stock off us on a steady, regular basis. No auction block, no one-off deals. A standing handshake. Elena eyed them all. Young Bale stared at her, his face a real mix of cold math and downright honest-to-God curiosity. Just a greenhorn trying to figure out how this lady's agriculture startup beat the miserable odds the whole town bet on. What kind of volume are you thinking? She asked. They came prepared. The numbers were ready to draw. Spears rattled them off. Head counts per ranch, the delivery cycles, and the exact asking price. It was a mighty fair pitch. They weren't being greedy, just fair. Proved they pitched what she needed to hear, not what they selfishly wanted. Out west, that's high respect. Elena let the silence hang. Her mind drifted to that supply chain mess she'd chewed over with Whitmore 3 days back. She weighed his fancy contacts and the tough question of what kind of ranch she was really building. And how to feed it. Shaking hands with local cattlemen was a whole different animal than importing through Whitmore's distant network. It was blood-close, deeply tangled, and messy. The way breaking bread with your neighbors is always messier than dealing with strangers. But to her bones, it felt right. This rugged valley watched her build from dust. Sure, they'd chucked doubt sneers and a solid bet she'd wash out. But Spears wrote that January letter. Pruitt came to the fence and confessed he was dead wrong. Calla slapped down $20 on a vision she saw early. That ain't a town completely gunning for her downfall. It was just folks being folks, chewing things over, slow, and coming around in their own sweet, flawed human time. I'll take stock from all three spreads, she declared. On these terms, she laid down the law. Head price, health standards, delivery schedules. Her absolute right to turn away. Scrawny beasts with zero apologies beyond a simple stamp of rejection. She spelled it out in plain prairie English, just like Whitmore taught her. No fluff, no sorries. And not one man fought her on it. Croft actually looked a hair relieved, probably bracing for a much bloodier shootout over pennies. Young Bale scribbled in his little pocket ledger. Seeing that, Elena figured the kid just might survive on his daddy's land after all. When they left, Iris leaned on the fence. We can all picture it, watching those men walk away, their mumbles fading into the freezing western air. You and I know that tone. Grown cattlemen quietly swallowing their pride and backing down. Those were the exact same fellas laughing at us last fall, Iris pointed out. No real venom, just stating facts. Not all of them, Elena replied. Bale skipped the auction. Close enough. Elena stayed quiet a beat. They rode up here, she murmured. That matters. They could have easily kept buying from the cheap rendering outfit down the valley. Instead, they rode up our trail. She stared down that snowy trail where those three ranchers had just vanished past the creek. That means something. Iris gave her that hard, sideways glance she saved for whenever Elena was being entirely too forgiving about things, but she wisely kept her mouth shut. Now true winter hit Broken Ridge right around early December, coming in mean and heavy. No more gentle autumn frost, just the crushing weight of a brutal Wyoming winter dropping from the high country. Snow fell hard and stuck fast. The creek crossing froze entirely solid. The trail was open, but totally treacherous, so wagon shipments down to Delaney and Whitmore got bumped to every 3 weeks instead of 4, just to survive the ice. But inside that smokehouse, none of that mattered. Those thick stone walls trapped the heat. The hearth fires breathed steady through channels buried underground. Sweet blue smoke rolled up through the burning hickory and applewood, drifting out into air that was 20 degrees below freezing while the meat stayed perfectly warm inside. Every morning at 4 a.m., Elena walked the dark property with a brass lantern, a thermometer, and her battered notebook. Every single reading matched perfectly with the data she'd been tracking for months and out here. That kind of stubborn consistency was a miracle. Nothing flashy, not something you'd notice riding past, just quiet proof of brutal hard work, finally running like clockwork. That herd had grown to 61 head of cattle now. The new livestock folded right into an expanded grazing rotation that Petra managed with such dead-on precision. Elena quit double-checking her work completely. Iris had completely taken the reins on the weekly vet checks, handling the animals with a sharp, ruthless eye that caught 2 sick calves in autumn before they could ever become a real disaster. Elena still made the final call on production which cattle, when, exactly how, but the daily ranch chores rested on other folks' shoulders just as much as hers, and she had built it that way on purpose. Let's pause here together. Late one Sunday in mid-December, Elena hiked up the ridge above her homestead, just like she did when the harsh weather finally broke. Not for any real chore, just to take in the sheer scale of the empire she'd carved out. A view you simply couldn't appreciate while buried down in the mud of daily work. The drifts were so thick she had to kick her own trail up the mountain, tracing a jagged line of scrub oak she'd known by heart since she was a little girl. The bitter cold was pure and honest, the kind of freezing wind that strips a mind bare and leaves nothing but absolute clarity. Looking down from that high ridge, her entire ranch laid out below. the warm glow of the cabin window, the massive barn she had expanded back in September, newly reinforced just to shelter all those extra head of cattle. Both of those stone chimney caps, puffing rich ribbons of smoke straight up into the dead, quiet sky. Just a steady, unhurried rhythm they hadn't broken once in nearly a full calendar year. She saw the snowy trail winding from her gate down to Durant's Valley, and out there on that freezing dirt road, even at dusk, deep wagon ruts from a whole week of heavy beef deliveries were permanently frozen into the packed snow. She just stood up there, breathing it in. Her mind drifted to her late father, stacking those heavy smokehouse stones by hand, perfectly smoothing the mortar and painstakingly carving out those underground vents. The old man couldn't have explained it. He'd just say it felt right to do a hard job correctly. She pictured her mother digging those apple saplings into the South Ridge dirt without some grand master plan, just a pioneer's quiet faith that a strong root outlives the planter. She weighed exactly what it meant to inherit a wild piece of land from folks who worked it with that kind of quiet, fierce devotion. It wasn't fortune-telling or genius, just a stubborn frontier refusal to ever cut corners. And she thought about how terrifyingly close she'd come to surrendering it, almost letting the crushing banknotes, the town gossip, and the heavy expectations of reasonable men chase her off the only patch of dirt she truly loved. But she dug her boots in. She worked this rugged land and finally unearthed exactly what she always knew was hiding right here. The toll had cost her far more than she expected, but mercifully less than her darkest nightmares. It meant trusting folks she never dreamed she'd need, and the struggle had shaped her in ways she was still just starting to understand. Here's what she learned since last autumn. It's an easy truth for you and I to preach, but a brutally hard one to actually survive out here. You and I both know the gap between a grand idea and a working operation is just sweat and specifics. Not luck, not some tall tale told afterward. Specifics. The bitter chill at 4 a.m, a restless mare favoring her left hind hoof, the land deed that needs fixing, and that quiet moment you finally let another hand carry the load. Because you realize you can't shoulder it all forever, and admitting that ain't failure. It's just plain survival. Down below the valley lay pitch black, save for the scattered lights of Durant shining warm across the winter stretch. But up on the ridge, the frost pressed in tight. Elena's breath hung in heavy clouds, fading right into the dead, still night air. She stood watching the smoke from 2 cabin chimneys rising straight and steady. Down in the warm barn, the herd was bedded down. Just that deep, quiet calm of livestock properly fed and safe from the wind. By sunrise, they'd be moved by a 15-year-old ranch hand who had learned their names, their quirks, and every little habit with a sharp thoroughness that still caught Elena completely off guard sometimes. She waited up on the ridge until the bitter chill cut right through her thick coat. Then she finally turned back, heading down the steep grade, just tracking her own boot prints through the fresh snow. The trail down was easier, like it always is. Hitting the bottom of the draw, she stopped at the smokehouse and stepped inside. Checked the hanging thermometer, scrawled the numbers in her logbook, cranked the east-facing vent closed by a quarter turn. She stood soaking in the heat, smelled the hickory, the applewood, and that rich pride of a thing built from pure scratch, born from a rugged hillside, a tough question, and a whole year of pure stubbornness. She headed up to the cabin, stoked the iron stove, and settled down at the rustic kitchen table with black coffee and that thick operating manual she had drafted over 2 spring evenings, the same one she entrusted to Caleb Birch for safekeeping. She read the pages over, not because her memory was fading, but because she was finally ready to pen a chapter she'd been avoiding. Nothing technical, not about wood ratios or meat curing times, but about those rugged truths that are much harder to document. About staring down something everyone else had cast aside and still having the grit to see its true value. About the iron patience needed when you understand a truth before proving it. You see, it's about the bitter isolation of being right too early and that quiet comfort of still standing when the proof rides in. She didn't know who'd ever read the thing, Maybe nobody. Maybe Petra years down the trail, if she stuck it out. Maybe some stranger she hadn't met yet. Didn't matter. She wrote it because it was the honest truth. Because hard truths deserve to be written in ink sharp enough to bridge that vast stretch between one pioneer's sweat and another person's understanding. Out there, the snow just kept falling over Broken Ridge, quiet and downright indifferent, burying the boot tracks, the steep slopes, the apple orchard, and that rugged stone smokehouse, a place built by an old man who truly believed in doing a job right for reasons he only half understood, before handing the reins over to a daughter who took what he left behind, carrying it toward a frontier you and I know they couldn't map. That smoke kept rising up, the fires kept burning, the hard work marched on.